All right, let's take our Bibles, if you would, and turn to Ruth, chapter 1. I was watching some cats a while back, and this one little cat was like romping around, jumping up and down, banging into the older cat. And the older cat was just sitting there all grumpy and crabby. And I thought, isn't that a lot like people? You have the little kids, and they run around, they got all this energy, and they're just tearing around, killing it. And then adults, it's so easy for us to go like, stop, and be crabby and grumpy. I think that's probably because the kids have not experienced the hardness of life, the ups and downs, and the troubles like adults have, and unfortunately, it can turn us into people who are grumpy and crabby. Have you known someone that is pretty much grumpy and crabby because of what's been through in their life? And yet you'll look at someone else who may have had just as many problems, and they're full of joy and happiness. What's the secret to that? Because you don't want to become that person, a crabby, grumpy person. You want to be the joyful person, even though you have problems in your life. How do you do that? What is the secret to avoiding the grumpiness and crabbiness and becoming a person of joy and peace? That's what we're going to look at this morning. We've been looking at how people responded to hardships in the Bible and trying to learn from them, and we've looked at Abraham and Joseph so far. Today we're looking at a mother. One of the mothers of the Bible didn't happen to be mentioned on stage here today, but we're going to look at her, and she faced probably one of the hardest things any mother could ever face in her lifetime, and that is the death of her child. And not just the death of one child, but two, and they were her only children. How would she respond? That's what God was looking to see, and what we want to learn from this morning, how she responded to this. We want to study what she did in order to avoid the bitterness and anger that can come, and to know peace and joy. So before us is the book of Ruth, and you might think, oh, we're going to talk about Ruth. We're not going to talk about Ruth. We're going to talk about what is maybe the more dominant character in the book of Ruth, and that is her mother-in-law, Naomi. So this morning, if you'd like to know the secret of keeping yourself from being bitter and knowing joy and peace, listen up. We'll look at the life of Ruth, or rather Naomi. Naomi lived in the little town of Bethlehem, just 5 miles south of Jerusalem. And she lived with her husband and her 2 sons. And this was not in the days of the kings of Israel. It was before the kings of Israel, when the judges were in Israel. And they think it was probably during Gideon's time of being a judge. And her name, Naomi, means pleasant. Isn't that a nice name? Pleasant. As far as we know, she and her husband and 2 sons had a pleasant life there in Bethlehem. Until one day, trouble hit. Look with me at Ruth 1, verse 1. It says, "Now it came about in the days when the judges governed that there was a famine in the land." Stop there. Imagine going to your cupboard tomorrow morning and you open it up and there's no food. No food in the fridge, no food in the pantry or where else you might keep food. For weeks and weeks, there's been trouble with supply of food. The store shelves have been getting thinner and thinner and barer. People have been buying, and now there's nothing in the stores and there's nothing in your shelves. What would you do? What would you do? That's a situation that these people faced. And we look at what they did. Trouble had hit them in the form of famine. Let's look what they did. Look at the rest of verse 1. "And a certain man of Bethlehem in Judea went to sojourn in the land of Moab with his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi. And the names of their 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem in Judea. Now they entered the land of Moab and remained there." Okay, so here we learn about famine hits lands, crops not growing, people are starving, and there is news that 50 miles away there is food. That'd be like up in State College. There's food up in State College. And they decide, okay, let's pack up and move there since that's where food is. That sounds like a reasonable idea, except it meant leaving Israel as the nation and going to an enemy nation, what has a long time been an enemy nation, mistreating Israel, the nation of Moab. Uh, God forbid Israel to make peace treaties with Moab because their history had been so bad. God did not accept the men of Moab to be able to come and live in Israel. You couldn't do that as a man. There was a lot of conflict there. And on regular occasions, Moab would cross into Israel and attack it. And one time, they attacked the city of Jericho and occupied it for 18 years. It didn't belong to Israel. It belonged to these men who had come in from Moab. So there wasn't a good relationship here between these two countries. And yet we find this man and his family are willing to leave the promised land, leave God's people behind, leave, this is where God made us to live, and go into this enemy nation. It tells you how desperate it must have been, that they were willing to give all that up in order just to survive. So this is the first thing that Naomi loses. If you want in your insert, Naomi has three great losses, and the first is the loss of her home and family. The loss of her home and family. They're getting up, leaving everything behind, or maybe her parents lived there, brothers and sisters, who knows? But they all moved. They stayed behind, and her family moved to Moab. The Bible does not say whether or not Naomi agreed with her husband's choice here, but from what we know later on in the story, it doesn't seem likely that she would agree with this. She was leaving the promised land, leaving her hometown, leaving her home to live in this enemy country, but she was a wife. And particularly in those days, you didn't have much to say if you were the wife. Have you ever found yourself in a situation like that, where something that you do not want to do, you're being dragged into it by somebody else? And try as you might to say, I don't want to do this, it's the wrong idea, you're powerless. And you're being carried away into this other situation by someone else, and you might feel very much like a victim of this other person. You don't want to do that thing, and you're having to do it anyway. What does God say to us in those times? Maybe you're in that time right now. What does God say to you? Two wonderful verses in the Bible. I encourage you to write these down. Isaiah 41:13. I, the Lord your God, hold your right hand and say to you, don't be afraid. I will help you. That is what God says whenever we're in a situation that we feel like, I'm aimless. I'm just being pulled into this thing I don't want to do. God says, I have hold of your right hand. And what is to be our response when that happens? It says in Psalm 73:23, you should say, nevertheless, I am continually with you. You have taken hold of my right hand. With your counsel, you will guide me, and afterwards receive me to glory. If you're powerless in a situation, headed in a direction you don't want to go, God says here, trust me. He says, you're not a victim here of just random circumstances. I am holding your hand. Don't be afraid. I will guide you. I'll lead you in the right direction. Just trust me. And that's what he would be saying to Naomi. My husband wants to go. I don't want to go. God's saying, I have you. Trust me. Don't be afraid. I'll take care of you. And if you're in a situation like that, let these verses comfort you. They're wonderful verses. So Naomi packs up her family and they head out, they move, but life doesn't get better in Moab. Look at verse 3. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her two sons. So Naomi and her husband make this move, the difficult move to Moab in order to survive, and he dies. This gives the second great loss of Naomi's life in your insert there. The loss of her husband and provider. The loss of her husband and provider. It doesn't say how he died, but was this God's discipline for leaving the promised land and going into an enemy nation? We don't know. But nevertheless, the result is that she's alone in a foreign country with no one to provide for her. In these days, being a widow was a desperate situation. First of all, widows were not allowed to inherit anything, so all the land and wealth that her husband had would not go to her. It wasn't like now she has these resources. She doesn't have them. Didn't go to women. Widows were among the most impoverished and disadvantaged people in society. They were on the same level as orphans. The one good thing that was going on is that she had two sons who were older. And the sons would inherit their father's wealth, so that's great. And then the second thing is they were, by law, required to take care of their widowed mother. So things were bad. She was in a foreign country without a husband, that her sons were able to take care of her, and they had the resources to take care of her. So things were looking good. But, verse 4. The sons took for themselves Moabite women as wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other, Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years. And then both Mahon and Kilion, her sons, also died. And the woman was bereft, left without her two children and her husband. So here is Naomi's third great loss, the loss of her sons and her family line. Loss of her sons and her family line. Her only source of provision had been her husband, and that's gone. Now it falls to her sons, and now they're gone. And now she's left alone in a foreign country as a widow. And not just needing to provide for herself, she's got two widowed daughter-in-laws now. 3 widows living together in this foreign country, and no man to take care of them. Into this dark situation, Naomi basically decides enough is enough. Look at verse 6. Then she arose with her daughter-in-law that she might return from the land of Moab, for she had heard that in the land of Moab that the Lord had visited his people in giving them food. So she hears that there's food again in Israel, and so she decides, let's return to Israel. But she says, look, my daughter-in-laws are both Moabites. They're not Israelites. So go back to your families. Go back to your fathers. Go back to your homes. I'm going back to Israel. And the one listens to her and returns to her family. The other says, no, I am not going back. I'm staying with you. And this was Ruth. Look at verse 16. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything but death parts you and me. Wow. And when she saw that she was determined to go with her, Naomi said no more to her. And so they both went until they came to Bethlehem. And when they had come to Bethlehem, all the city was stirred because of them. And the woman said, is this Naomi? And she said to them, do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi? Since the Lord has witnessed against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me. 10 years had gone by. She left, comes back 10 years later, and she says, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. Naomi meant what? Pleasant. Mara means bitter. In your inserts, that was Naomi's reaction to her loss. What was her reaction? Losing her sons, losing her husband. The reaction is bitterness. Bitterness. We've been looking at these different examples in the Bible of people who experience hardship. Abraham and Joseph were good reactions that we can learn from. Here is our first bad reaction that we can also learn from. Naomi had the bad response of being bitter. And she wants the people of Bethlehem, she isn't just feeling bitter. She says, I want to change my name. I want to change my identity to bitter. That's how bad she was bitter. What is bitterness? Bitterness is a harsh, unpleasant taste. Naomi had said, look, I've become a harsh, unpleasant woman. So call me Mara. Call me bitter. Naomi shows us the real danger of falling into bitterness after we've gone through a hardship. She did. No one wants to be bitter, but sometimes you feel that's the only way out. The stuff lands on you and there's no other response, just to be bitter about it. And there's no question about where she understood that this was coming from. She did not view this as a bunch of random, terrible circumstances that happened in her life. It says, verse 20, the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. Verse 21, the Lord has brought me back empty. Verse 21, the Almighty has afflicted me. She's bitter about God. She's disillusioned with God because she says, He's the one who led me into this. Could He have stopped this? Absolutely. She calls Him the Almighty, the one with all might to be able to control things here, and He didn't control it, and now she's bitter. Maybe you can relate with that. I think all of us can relate to times when we've gone through hardships and it's gone terribly and it's just left us bitter. Maybe disillusioned with God because you knew He could have stopped it and He didn't. It can happen to any of us when we suffer. And it can last a day or a month. It can last years. Maybe you know someone who many years ago was hurt and is still bitter about it. Maybe that's you. That's what we want to learn from Naomi, Mara, that we should not respond in that way. What should Naomi have done? Naomi should have noted that this was not the end of her life, but that it was a very dark valley that God was leading her through. The fact that God was not done leading her. This wasn't the final destination. That there was going to be good that God would lead her to after this because she was one of His people. She should have noted that. Instead, she didn't believe that. She didn't believe it was going to get better. She said, God led me to this bitter spot, and that's where I'm going to be, and I'm bitter about it. And because of her unbelief, she experienced all this grief in her life. But God tells us we are supposed to believe that He's going to lead us all to a good place in the end, and with eyes of faith, see that future. We're not experiencing that future, but we see that future good that's coming. And with eyes of faith, look at that. She wasn't looking there. She was looking down at her hardship, and it made her bitter. But God says repeatedly in the Bible, I will always lead my people to end in good. Look at Deuteronomy 8:16. In the wilderness, God fed you manna, that He might humble you and that He might test you. Why? To do good for you in the end. Israel had troubles in the desert. But where did they end? In good. God says, yes, but I wasn't done leading you. I led you to good in the promised land. Romans 8:35 and 37 say, can anything ever separate us from Christ's love? Does it mean He no longer loves us if we have trouble or calamity or are persecuted or are hungry or cold or in danger or threatened with death? The answer is no. Despite all these things, overwhelming victory is ours through Christ. We have troubles like these. All of us do. But where does God say they end? They don't end with that trouble. God says, I end you to victory. That's the final destination. 2 Corinthians 4:17. Our suffering is light and temporary, and is producing for us an eternal glory that is greater than anything we can imagine. We have troubles in our lives, but where do they end? In eternal glory, God says. Joseph looked ahead with the eyes of faith when he was in prison, when he was, a slave. He looked ahead with the eyes of faith, and he saw the good that was coming, and it kept him going in the hard times. We never read about Joseph being bitter. Naomi, who became Mara, would not look ahead with their eyes of faith. She looked down at the darkness she was in, and she became bitter. And that's what we want to learn from her. Don't do that. I think it would have helped her if we could have gone up to Naomi. I think it would have helped her say, Naomi, what is your goal in your suffering? And she probably would have said, what do you mean goal in my suffering? God led me into this dark, bitter place, and I'm bitter about it. I have no goal. And I think that was the problem. I think she had no goal. She was just feeling bad, and it made her bitter. But if we had said to her, Naomi, God has a goal for you as you suffer here. The goal is to focus on God's goodness that is coming. And if she had said, oh, all right, this is bad, but this is where it ends, I will focus with the eyes of faith on the goodness that's coming. If she had made that her goal, I think she would have had a completely different experience, because she wouldn't have been bogged down in the terrible present, but occupied with the good future that was coming. As I said, no one wants to live in bitterness. It just kind of descends upon you. You feel like you have no way out, but there is a way out. The way out is to focus off of the darkness you're in and upon the goodness that God is bringing. To kill complaining and all the, focus on the present, and to focus with your eyes of faith onto the future. That's what we learn from her. Living in joy and peace does not depend upon your circumstances going well. It doesn't. Because you don't have to focus on that. You kill the focus on the present and you focus on the joy and the goodness of God that is coming. And you can know joy and peace. You really can. Joseph seems to have done that. Naomi definitely did not do that. She teaches us, don't focus on the loss of your bitterness. That's our lesson from her. Well, maybe you know the rest of her story. The rest of her story is that Naomi moves back to Bethlehem with her daughter-in-law Ruth, two widows without a man to take care of her, real poverty situations. Ruth goes out into the fields around her home to find food that the harvesters would have left on the ground, and so she's basically picking up food off the ground, putting it in baskets, and trying to take care of the two of them that way. The very first day she goes out, she finds herself in the field of a wealthy man named Boaz. He happens to notice her among all the people there. He notices her and has compassion on her and offers her protection, because apparently those single woman alone in those fields could be hurt by men. She comes back home that evening with a large amount of food, grain, that she collected, and Naomi sees this. Look at chapter 2, verse 19. It says, her mother-in-law then said to her, where did you glean today, and where did you work? May he who took notice of you be blessed. So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and said, the name of the man with whom I work today is Boaz. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed of the Lord, who has not withdrawn his kindness to the living and to the dead, probably referring to her dead husband. And again Naomi said to her, the man is our relative. He is one of our closest relatives. Here bitter Naomi sees a glimmer of hope. There was a law in Israel that pertained to widows. Probably heard about it. That if a man dies, and now it's his wife who survives him, if he had a brother, the brother's supposed to step in and marry her in order to keep the land in the family and keep the family line, the family name going. So the brother marries the sister-in-law. But what if he didn't want to marry her? Well, then it would go to the next closest male relative, maybe a cousin or an uncle or someone. And if that person didn't want to marry her, it would just go down the line until someone was found, a relative, who would marry the widow. And in Ruth's case, there was no brother for her to marry. And so it traveled down the line to the next closest relative. And this man, this Jewish man, was willing to marry her and basically get the land that would have come from her husband who had died. But there was a complication that came along that would mess up his own inheritance to his own son if he did this. So he said, I guess not. I'm not going to marry Ruth. And so who's the next one in line? It's Boaz, this wealthy farmer. Was it luck that Ruth found herself in that field that first day? Was it luck that Boaz happened to notice her out of all the workers? Was it luck that he extended protection to her? Was it luck that he just happened to be one of the closest relatives who could eventually marry her? No. The same hand that led God the hand of God that led into this dark time was the same hand that was leading her now into an abundant time. Same hand. God wasn't done leading. Look at chapter 4 and verse 13. Chapter 4, verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, Blessed is the Lord, who has not left you without a redeemer today, and may his name become famous in Israel. May he also be to you a restorer of life and a sustainer of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons has given birth to him. And then Naomi took the child and laid him in her lap and became his nurse. And the neighbor women gave him a name, saying, A son has been born to Naomi. So they named him Obed. They named him Obed, which means one who serves. And he is the father of Jesse, the father of David. The book of Ruth opens up with the spotlight on Naomi. Naomi and her family in trouble. They move. Her husband dies. Her sons dies. And then the spotlight turns to Ruth. And Ruth meets Boaz. And Ruth, he becomes the redeemer. And they get married. And they have a son. And then right here in the closing chapters of the book, everyone steps off stage. And Naomi is now in the spotlight. It's her story, really. The book of Ruth is mostly her story. And where had God led her from the beginning to the end? His hand led her into great darkness and despair, but his hand, at the closing verses of the book, is leading her into great abundance, great provision. How? What was it God provided for her? This is in your insert. Naomi's great good was her grandson, her grandchild. Naomi's great good is her grandson. God had led Naomi into this really dark place. God knew all along, I'm going to lead you and have you into a great end and great provision. You're here, but I know where I'm leading you. And she wouldn't believe it. She would not believe that God was bringing good in the future. And it caused her to just be miserable right here. I'm not just feeling bitter. I'm changing my name to bitter. That's bad. If she had just believed God all along, she could have been relieved of that ache. Now, in her lap lay the person that God had planned to bring into her life all along and take the place of her husband who died and then her sons who had died. It would be her grandson, Obed, which means he who serves. They said, this one is going to serve you, Naomi, in your old age. He is going to be your provider. He is going to be your heir to carry on your family name. He is the one who's going to inherit the family land so you don't lose that land. He's like your Savior, your Redeemer. The women in verse 15 say, he is a restorer of life. What they were saying there is, it's like Naomi died and became Mara. And then Mara died and resurrected as Naomi. In your inserts, this is the life skill we learned from Naomi's story. In your inserts, the life skill we learned. Believe that the same hand that leads you to great loss will lead you to great good. Believe that the same hand that leads you to great loss will lead you to great good. So many adults, as I said at the beginning, are cranky and grumpy because of the difficult things they've experienced in life. And God says it's not necessary. Yes, you can experience hard things and be taken down, and it's really miserable, but you don't have to live there. You can have, with the eyes of faith, and see the future that is coming, that the goodness of God is coming, and I'm going to focus on that. And that's what we learned from her life. Not in a positive way, but in a negative way, we learned this from her life. God's hand led her to great loss. God's hand later led her to great good. Which hand could be trusted? Both hands could be trusted. When God leads you to great loss, realize, okay, this is something he says, I know you don't want this. I know this is terrible, but there is a huge plan going on for your life, and this fits in. So look over that trouble at the goodness that's coming. to keep yourself from being bitter. This week I had been working on this, and I went down into my basement for something, and there was water all over. I don't like that. I've had that before, and is never something positive. And I started, admittedly, to get grumpy and cranky. And then it was like God said, wait a minute, what are you preaching on upstairs? You're preparing this thing. Come on, you got to practice what you preach. And I said, okay, I'm going to look over this problem that I have here. I didn't know what it was yet, but I said, look, I'm going to look over to the future. God says he's bringing great good at the end of this. All right. And it really changed my attitude. It really did. Instead of getting really sour about it. And I realized something had, our dehumidifier had become unplugged. And it was a simple matter of, plugging it back in and repositioning it. I had it done like about 5 minutes. And I felt a lot better, and things were resolved. But I'm really glad that I had just been studying this, because it helped me from really getting into distress. Because I've had experiences in my basement where it wasn't as simple as that. It required a lot of hard work. But that's what God is talking about. That's what God wants us to learn from Naomi. Don't do what Naomi did, is what God is saying. And we want to take that away. She felt she'd been betrayed, and she hadn't been betrayed. You can feel like you've been betrayed by God. You haven't been betrayed by God. God says, exercise your faith and see the future. Kill the complaining and the bitterness that might be rising up. Just say, no, I'm not doing that. I'm looking over this to what is coming on the other side. And God says it's good. And I'm going to focus on that. The same hand that led Abraham to sacrifice his son is the same hand that took him to be the father of many nations. And the same hand that led Job into great suffering that is epic led him in the end to receive double back everything that he lost. Double. Same hand that led Joseph into slavery led him to become the commander of Egypt. Same hand that led Daniel to be taken from his family and separated into this nation of Babylon was the one who put him in one of the most powerful leaders of Babylon. Same hand that led David to hide in a cave from Saul in the desert all those years was the same hand that elevated him to become one of the greatest kings of Israel. And the same hand that led Jesus to the cross is the same hand that exalted him to give him the name that is above every name. And that's true for you too. You've been through suffering. God's not done. It's not where it ends. His hand, he says, I hold you by my right hand. I am continually with you. Don't focus down like Mara, like Naomi did. Focus on the future. Goodness is coming. Let that carry you through. God says, don't be afraid. I will help you. Focus on God's goodness that is coming. That's our lesson for this morning.